So I think it's time to start. Thank you for coming along, everyone. Just a quick introduction, I guess. So my name's Chris, for those of you who haven't met me before. I'm a director in a couple of consultancies doing sort of similar things, I guess, but finding shores is where I do most of my innovative work. I've done a lot of random things, I suppose, throughout my career. And at the moment, I'm kind of working at adding a coaching element to a consultancy as well, and a few other things. I speak about collaboration quite a lot. So if you want to watch a TEDx on that and you're having trouble sleeping, you're more than welcome to go and do so. And just as a bit of a disclaimer, I thought I'd do something a little bit different with this, given that narratives are very important to me because I also write quite a lot of books. So I'm going to cover a few things, and there's a bit of an allegorical and metaphorical exploration, I guess. And I'm looking at the Tautai of leadership. Now, this is kind of a wayfinding thing. I know Sonia was speaking about wayfinding a little earlier. I think that wayfinding is a great concept, especially in complexity. So that's something that I'm going to explore a little. So probably the first thing to do would be to discuss what Tautai actually is. It's not a word that gets used quite as much, I think, as wayfinding. I think the concept is very powerful because it sums up a number of approaches for dealing with multiple entangled complexities, both human and natural. So Tautai is kind of it's cultural, it's integrated, it's aware, it's shared, and it has specialisms to it. It isn't just the concept of wayfinding. Wayfinding's kind of something that comes out of Tautai, I guess is a good way to put it. So wayfinding as a concept, I think very clearly is becoming better understood. I'm hoping very much it doesn't become yet another buzzword, although I guess the jury will have to be out on that for a little bit. But the concept of Tautai has elements to it in terms of leadership, agility, teamwork, this kind of all-important idea that you know that the journey is not the destination, that exploration and seeing where you really are so that you can move forward most effectively kind of comes from this innate acceptance that change is hard, and you have to commit to that, sometimes radically, but certainly with courage. And leave stability and safety when that's inhibitive. So you need to kind of try and thrive and probe the unknown with the curiosity and inspiration. And that's where, of course, a lot of innovation comes from. So for a voyage or a journey that isn't based on modern hierarchies and command structures to work, it tends to be very effective when everyone knows their place and has a part. I mean, we speak about transparency of communication in organizations. We speak about kind of ecosystemic approaches. The success of the voyage works best when it's the success of everyone who's involved, right? This is the collaboration side. You know, everyone has to be invested in the outcome for them to be fully engaged in it. So, you know, if they're just there to do a basic job, well, I think we've all been part of companies where people are there and encouraged to do nothing more than a basic job. So you see the disengaged and disenfranchised side of workers. There's a lot of that around at the moment. Obviously, we've had a lot of upheaval, but there's also this kind of insistence in the modern world where there's this heavy reliance on tools and technology, which may have created a bit of an isolated paradigm of decision-making and command. So it's important to remember at this point that, you know, an organization is made of people. The people are the agents within that system that actually get things done. And those people aren't just automatons or components. They have unique individual skills and drive, which just aren't often being effectively utilized or supported. So why am I looking at wayfinding and Tautai? Well, before the invention of a lot of these tools, before the invention of processes and frameworks, the compass, the sextant, clocks, GPS more recently, Pacific Islanders navigated open ocean voyages with no instruments at all. They used observation of stars, the sun, ocean swells, and other signs around them, other signifiers for clues to direction and their location, and it told them what was really there, regardless of any changes that were happening at the time. So essentially, in complexity terms, they were sense-making in real time, and their experience and the stories that came from that taught and drove their beliefs, which dictated the right actions to gain the results which led them to the best outcome. So they were navigating the best path through complexity. So when we look at breaking wayfinding and the process of wayfinding down, and a little bit about how we ignore it, it's generally acknowledged to be made up of 4 pieces. We have an orientation part where we try to work out where we are and where we're going to be going. We decide on the route that is going to get us there, the best course based upon conditions at the time, but also upon history. We then look at monitoring that route in real time with real-time feedback, and that's really important. Again, there's already been mentioned in several tracks about the value of fast feedback and the ignorance of fast feedback in organizations. That's critical for you to continue to know that you're heading in the right direction and dousing the new paths that you're potentially finding the opportunities for. And then, of course, the destination recognition is an interesting one, because we tend to treat the end of a journey as the end of a journey. And of course, it's a waypoint in a larger journey. Sometimes we can be so focused on things like metrics, we don't actually recognize that waypoint when it arrives. So having those elements is essentially the arc of wayfinding when you're on the limited arc of a journey from one point to another. And I think that one of the important things about how wayfinding works is that you understand and map the constraints that exist and what they are, and understand that they can't necessarily be controlled, that we move through an ecosystem as part of it. I think there's a particular hubris in modern business where we seek to control and impose pseudo constraints that we prefer on reality, which can make dousing exactly where you are and actually being effective very difficult. So the value of wayfinding in uncertain and unknown spaces is that we're forced to acknowledge the effects of chance, the effects of serendipity, the greater systems that we move through outside the one we see immediately before us. Right, so this is very, I think, apt in terms of the current ebb and flow of the business landscape, the acceleration of it, the biases creeping in, which means we don't always effectively engage consumers or employees as ethically, as sustainably, or in terms of generational expectation as we could. So it's not all about that one goal you never let go of, or just working hard. I think we've all been in places where the universe has had other plans, no matter what we've planned, no matter what actions we've taken. So those who not only survive but thrive do so, I think, through a kind of dual-sided coin of agility and resilience, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. So talking then about Tautai itself, this kind of is where the wayfinding is kind of the root of the wayfinding, I guess, is a way to put it. So those who seek paths for others to journey and to help them along those paths, and maybe even journey with them, are generally called guide, Tautai, navigator, wayfinder, pathfinder. I've heard waymaker used before. I guess if you're exerting a certain influence on the environment, that can happen as well. So the essence of Tautai is the transition of an entire culture through a vast, complex ocean of uncertainty, using narratives in song and story to pass qualitative and quantitative information along, with a deep and constant awareness of the ever-changing context that we're within, especially around the boats. So you have your winds, your currents, your clouds, sun, moon, stars, sea life, and more. And through that process, constantly adapting, repurposing, and responding to make you better sustain, learn, and improve the journey. So it's this collaborative focus on outcome. But more than that, it's a perception of our place in things, where we've come from, and the complex domain we have to submit to, probably more than we're willing to admit. So with Tautai, what I love about it is that apparently there was not very much in terms of retrospective coherence. The ocean itself was almost like a sensor network that was used. The people on the boats were a human sensor network as well. The stories and songs codified what had happened to make sure that, you know, the essence of it wasn't lost, so that what happened wasn't justified outside the typical myths that we tend to generate as humans. And there was kind of almost this awareness of an oceanic pulse, which is very interesting because, you know, I've met an awful lot of managers in my time, and there are very few managers that I've met who actually know the pulse within their company and within their organization, within the people. And a lot of them have created a retrospective coherence to say, you know, something entirely different and far more comfortable. So navigators knew their role. The crews of the boats and the canoes knew their role. All the passengers had roles and a part. So it was a really collaborative place for everyone. And that included people who were a bit different, the outliers, the heretics, the mavericks. Anyone on this journey can display leadership, can have a voice. I mean, the ancient Greeks, we know, had Kubernetes, which gets used quite a lot, but that was a little bit different. It was more of an authority figure and a helmsman. The Polynesian Tautai is kind of a broader, deeper range of interconnected disciplines, and they remain the best navigators and seafarers we've ever known, despite more recent technology, and perhaps because of it. Now, I find this particularly interesting just personally, because as somebody who is autistic and has a number of other neurodiverse traits, I'm very aware of the crushing need that modern business has for conformity internally. And this is very often to the detriment of the people and to the organization itself. When you are forcing conformity, you're actually inhibiting innovation, exploration, and that doesn't matter whether it's in business, in science, in philosophy. You know, you require outliers, you require people who see things, see patterns a little differently, have different drives and legitimacy models, I guess. And I'll talk a little more about legitimacy models in a bit. So Tautai wasn't about conforming, it was more about accepting everyone's unique place in society as you carried it with you. And the ancient Polynesian society was very inclusive. So just looking at the sequence that we have here, you have the teaching comes from the song and the story. It's an apprenticeship. The culture is a part of this. So it's deeply kind of rooted. And you have that learning aspect. And then when you go to take your journey, you explore the constraints, you probe the Pacific Ocean and the islands around you, a vast, complex, adaptive system, and you do it collaboratively together against past quantitative and qualitative information. And then you use the appropriate tools to set direction and map where things were. And then you stopped using those tools because it was taken as given that things may have changed. So it gave you a direction, it gave you an idea. And then as you moved off on that journey, you then used your sense making. So as you moved through that ecosystem, you looked at the ecosystemic signifiers, the raw data in real time around you, you sensed that, and you looked at the feedback. You displayed agility where necessary. You had resilience to some of the challenges. You kept curiosity and awareness of what was really there, and all the people were involved in this. So it was very inclusive. People had those defined roles, experience played a part. Everyone was engaged in what was happening. You know, this was a cultural journey. It wasn't just transporting people from A to B. And there was leadership throughout all of this, and it was all part of the ecosystem and journey. So there was adaptation, there was acceptation, there was response, there was innovation along the way if needed. And finally, and almost always, they reached their new shore, and it may not have been the one that they planned. A lot of the islands were discovered through serendipity. And then the learnings for that were incorporated, and they become part of the new songs, the new stories that taught new generations of navigators. So it's a very complete cycle of journeying, and all the way through there's this kind of really beautiful awareness of Tautai and of this kind of this wayfinding. I mean, change isn't comfortable. It is uncertain, especially in the modern world, especially in the modern business world. But it obviously is also necessary to adapt, to survive, to thrive. I think it's beautiful when an entire culture is set up around the idea of change and exploration and, you know, dealing with complexity and understanding that complexity exists. And we can see the success over time of Tautai. This isn't, you know, kind of an old wishful thinking thing. You can see how big the Pacific is here. I mean, it's a pretty big place, and the islands that they were going to were tiny. Easter Island, I believe, is the most remote inhabited island on Earth. I think it's about 64 square kilometers. It's not very big at all. And it is believed that it was deliberately aimed for and explored. So it wasn't just a chance find as far as we're aware. What's also interesting about how this worked was that the navigators weren't actually in charge of these voyages, or just the experts coming along for the ride to, you know, deliver a bit of expertise. They were also knowledge managers of history and methodology, and they were very respected. They were listened to, but they were augmented by everyone around them as well. So they were a part of the journey. They weren't just, you know, external to it. So they were leaders, you know, they led their entire cultures to new shores. And that culture itself was about that ability to journey. So Polynesians became the greatest navigators in the world through this process, feeling their way through each emergent, unique journey, many, many hundreds of years before Europeans managed to do the same thing. And for Europeans, tools were used pretty much from the beginning to prepare for voyages, to learn, which is fine, but they actually ended up forming and constraining a lot of those voyages as well. We didn't get that same level of probing the ecosystem to be able to, you know, understand where we were and what was there. We still relied on tools, and we still do that in Western business to this day. So the tools were used in context as required, and the journey became the way. And you had that adaptation, that acceptation, that response as you went through. So those stories then became part of the teaching, as I said on the last slide. And that knowledge over time deepened and got better. Now, remember, the Pacific is a particularly complex system. It's not just an ocean. You have huge amounts of typhoons out there. There are more hurricanes in the Atlantic, but you have, you know, volcanic eruptions and tidal waves, the occasional island full of cannibals. You know, there were quite a few dangers. There were quite a few unknowns that you wouldn't have necessarily had in the Mediterranean. And it's important to note that this was not about efficiently populating these islands. This was really effectively about exploring, learning, and journeying. It's an incredibly human story, and I think it's fantastic. So there's an interesting analogy to how they kind of, I don't know what the word would be, wayfinded, in some modern science. So when we're talking about signifiers and we're looking at what's there, I like to take geology and topography here and look at these. So we have geology defining the topography above, so it's the base, and then the topography above is signifying to us what the geology below actually is. Now that changes slightly, and I think fits better to a complex adaptive system in human terms when you look at a marine environment, because you have these kind of real-time modifiers in human terms. You have the tides, you have, you know, transient animal life that moves through a volume at any given moment. So they're agents within a system which do have an effect, and hidden effects. So you have the plankton, the biodiversity, apex predators, scavengers, migration patterns, those kind of things. You have weather, swell, wind, the pulses of the ocean that they talk about in Tautai. And you can't shape these things like you can shape the land. Water is quite difficult to shape. It's endlessly in motion. You know, it's uncontrollable more or less to someone on a boat. The ultimate complex environment, if you like, your impact on the environment is relatively minimal. but you can manage the affordances. And Sonia was talking about affordances earlier. You're being given affordances in this environment as well. It's just managed in a different way. There's also a really interesting phenomenon called tilapa, which is known as the flashing, where Tautai navigators would see a flash of light coming in a straight line from land. It doesn't happen very often. It's still relatively unexplained as phenomena, but I think it's fantastic because it kind of highlights a human analogy to unexplained phenomena which point the way. In slightly more abstracted terms, when you have a flash of intuition, when you match something through abductive reasoning, you're matching patterns with linkages, and that's the logic of hunches, as we mention in a few complex things. I know Dave Snowden talks about it here and there. So that guidance without logic, I think, is fantastic to have as a phenomena in the marine environment as well. But as we know, the sea is not without its dangers, possibly with more, because it's an environment which probably tolerates humans less than land. So that greater respect, understanding, and resilience, I think, is required for this particular system. And of course, one of the most obvious things there is the storms that can occur. Crises lurk. There are tidal waves, there are storms, there's bad weather, there are hurricanes, and whether they're typhoons, orthodoxy shifts and trophic cascades in business, innovations, market crashes, depressions, war, there will always be storms for ships. There will always be storms for companies. And what's interesting is how those traditionally conditioned to control and, insisting that things are ordered respond, versus those who accept the flux of a complex adaptive system and know how to douse which domain they're actually in and then manage it appropriately. So if we have a quick look at the slide over on the right, now taking into account that there were less boats and traffic back in kind of older times with the Polynesian navigators, and there was less kind of recording of it, but they knew when storms were coming. And the outcome that they reached for was always the safety of their people, the continuation of their culture. They accepted the risks of the ocean, but they didn't take them unprepared, casually, or without sensibly mitigating risks where they could. And very few of them were lost in the tales that we understand. Even if a canoe capsizes, there are ways to right it in the middle of the sea. So everyone on it could be flung into the sea. You could right it, you could continue on your way even after a storm. If a storm did catch them and they couldn't get to a storm harbour, you'd do some unthinkable things in terms of resilience that you wouldn't do in the modern world necessarily. You would perhaps obviously get down the sails and spars, jettison the entire cover on the boat if it was catching the wind and threatening, the lives of the people on there. Sea anchors are a very good idea for helping you maintain a heading, but actually deliberately swamping your canoe so that everyone's in the water where there's much less buffeting. The boat is in the water, but it still has some flotation, and allowing the storm to pass, kind of almost becoming part of it. That speaks to me of a really interesting kind of approach to resilience and kind of moving through this complex and volatile circumstance. It's also admirably safe to fail, I think. So everyone would know what to do, and the survival of everyone would be shared. So if we compare this to the approach of two of the ships that are mentioned on the left, we've got the Titanic and we've got the El Faro, which is an allegory reflected in modern business management, and it's been in several books now, actually. The last book I read with it in was Leadership is Language by David Marquet. The quotes are from captains where ships went down with great loss of life, not only because of the environment, but because of complacency, because of hubris, because of misunderstanding what domain that they were in, and an over-reliance on things like robustness, tools, fail-safes. Almost certainly, both of those tragedies could have been avoided if the context was doused and feedback was paid heed to. I think the El Faro is perhaps a better management example, though. There were several inflection points, and if you look at the map on the bottom left, where there could have been a difference and the storm could have been avoided, or certainly the severity of it. I believe they finally went down with all hands 20 miles from the eye of a Category 4 hurricane. And there were plenty of other options available earlier on. So the first inflection point of weak and then, quite frankly, strong signals was ignored. The real-time feedback was ignored. The tools that they had were totally relied upon. The frameworks that they used were totally relied upon, whatever the context. There was no challenge to authority from the subordinates. They had no safety or autonomy to avoid what they knew could, and eventually did, kill all of them. Language was used, and language, again, I think Sonia mentioned it, language is incredibly important for this stuff, and it was used very specifically to discourage any kind of challenge or suggestions the captain wasn't totally right. Getting it done at all costs was key. And then the second inflection point, which is in flexuous curves in apex predator theory, we look at weak signals and then we look at change or die. The second point was missed as well. The captain dismissed a lot of issues, and he was absent. He went to sleep for 8 hours during the kind of outside lip of a hurricane. He was managing. He wasn't leading through a complex circumstance and environment, by example. So in the end, nearly 800-foot-long cargo ship was lost with all hands. And I think that part of leadership's value is the ability to make the right, inclusive and cognitively shared decisions, despite the very, very human presence in all of us of emotion and ego. When a storm is felt, the Polynesian navigators run. They keep such a good eye, they pretty much always know when danger is coming. And wayfinding has resurged. It has started being taught out now to men and women. So it is having a revival, which is fantastic. But to face a hurricane down rather than take quite literally any opportunity to avoid it, I mean, it's tragic folly. But this kind of behavior is often conditioned and reinforced by a dark triad that I'll mention in a few slides. And that comes from a lot of old school management science, the discipline, the decision-making, the commands. Captain Davidson was also a victim of the organization's management culture. And that's now been recognized, after the investigations. They showed that training, oversight, burnout, fatigue, poor equipment and a poorly fitted ship, command pressure, the tools that were provided, even the lifeboats for survival, none of them were adequate to the task, and they could have all been done properly by the company. This is the worst kind of catastrophic complacency-induced failure that you can get in a complex system, because it is terminal feedback. There's no coming back from what happened to them. I do wonder, I think about this here and there, how a wayfinder on a huge ship like El Faro would have acted. I don't think it would have been like a manager. I suspect it would have been like a leader. Whether that would have been countenanced or not, we'll never know. So there's an introduction to Tautai, and kind of a bit more about the roots of wayfinding, I guess, certainly in Polynesian culture. So how does all this apply then to the modern world of business? I think some of it's probably relatively self-evident, but we know that, over time, upheavals like Brexit, the recent pandemic, the climate emergency, the energy crisis that we have in a lot of the West due to war, and the difficulty actually of engaging new generations of customers, especially in looming depressions, it's actually prompted business to grudgingly acknowledge that our world is increasingly complex, especially when you start looking at the paradigms of working from home and so forth. And it's moving at a greater pace of change than ever, despite all of these challenges. And yet, time and time again, I still personally, and I'm sure a lot of you do, see the belief that one person in charge, using rigid control and ideas that have always purported to work, is the best way to get things done. I find humans really fascinating because natively we navigate and adapt to uncertainty, complexity, learning really, really well. We've done so for tens of thousands of years. And it's one of the reasons we've become the dominant cognitive species on the planet, certainly. Yet especially in modern times, I think we've learned to navigate complexity and learned to learn really badly. We love physical and mental comfort and convenience so much that we will actively avoid discomfort and change. We're seeking the least energy cost, even if it's counterproductive or harmful to us long term. And we focus generally on immediate gratification, whether that means, you know, short-term profit or otherwise. This is very problematic individually, but when it's reflected by people in charge, it's throwing progress and survivability of entire systems into doubt. And that can be businesses, and that can be entire countries. So how do we learn to best identify, accept, and move through these? I mean, we've already discussed some of that when we were talking about Tautai, but I find this a particularly good way to think about what I see all the time in senior management and in organizations. We love maps because they tell us where we are or where we think we are. We love plans, we love roadmaps, we love charts, and so on and so on. But when the landscape is changing or has changed, a map is no longer any use to us. You know, we need to find other ways, because our destination may not be where we thought. It may not even be reachable anymore if it was in the first place. Are we even sure we're now starting from the same point that we thought we were in? If we take the exact same route that others did before, or, you know, which we pre-planned based on outmoded data, how effective will it be to follow that exact route if the landscape has changed? Do we keep using this map, this tool, regardless of context and the feedback that we may be potentially ignoring? So I like to think about it in terms of what we need being a compass, right? So we set a direction, and then we have the means to modify our journey as we go, essentially to wayfind, right? So when you're at sea, the landscape is permanently fluid. Having a guide to help explore waters with you, giving you context, unique tools and methods, perhaps your organization can use to evolve and grow. It's vital to finding your own new shores, to reaching your outcomes. An unknown harbor to a captain will often have a pilot come out because they know those waters, effectively like a consultant helping them, you know, move through a situation, right? So this is how companies can excel, by mistake sometimes. You've got that exaptation, that repurposing, that finding serendipity. A really good example of that was superglue. It was never meant to be an adhesive, and now it is ubiquitous. The problem is organizations aren't linear and ordered. I think we all know that. They appear to be so, but the problem is they're made of people, and the systems that we build and the people ourselves are complex. We exist in an organization not only based upon our skills or our job titles or our roles, we exist based upon the interactions, the connections, the relationships, the shared knowledge, the culture that has grown between people and teams, and none of that can just be copy-pasted. It grows over time in an entangled fashion. And this is one of the reasons I have issues with a modern interpretation of communities and practice, but that's another discussion. So helping people within companies find their own collaborative best way forward is almost akin to giving them their own compass and enabling and encouraging them to wayfind for the team, for the people, and so on. It means you can be more autonomous and optimally evolve for the workflow's unique requirements. It hugely benefits an organization. Individual strengths can add to this. They can be used to innovate and evolve. When they're suppressed and forced to conform, you don't get any of that richness within the org. So having a map or just sitting on traditional ways and culture only really leads us to loss and problems if the landscape and context have changed, and they are changing for most companies. I did mention this dark triad, and it gave me the opportunity to put one of the most looming visuals I've ever put in one of my slides down. And this is something I've been exploring a little bit, because I think that we talk about, you know, root causes and roots of all evil and so on. These are kind of dark constraints, kind of almost a meta dark constraint, I guess, because rather than paying attention to the thousands of years that we've spent dealing with shifting, complex, interconnected systems, you know, everything's digital these days. our brains are still analog. We still have to learn in the same fashion, but we almost try to force a digital learning approach on ourselves, and it doesn't really work. This is particularly prevalent in the West, but it goes out globally via the American dream. We've only had hundreds of years of dealing with contextually very specific systems, which we often insist are the best for everything. And we can, that's where we try to do our copy pasting from, because we want it to be easily replicable. There's that low energy cost thing that we always look for, right? But realistically, they were nothing better than survival of the luckiest at best, right? They were just good enough at the right time. And then that's been extrapolated as the way, and it's been baked into tradition, and now it's how it was always done. So in the immediate short term, there's a tiny fly there, where things are extremely stable, profit can be very high from this approach, don't get me wrong. Although the Business Roundtable 2018, I think it marked the first time CEOs collectively acknowledged that there were more values than just shareholder profit. And then, of course, we had the pandemic and we had a number of other things, and that may have been postponed for a while. But when that paradigm changes, there's real trouble. In the same way that sustained speed is a side effect of agility, not the end goal, and sustained profit is a side effect of excellence, not the main goal. But it's not within the interests of, obviously, the richest corporations and individuals to change how this works. Money is a bit of a high score. Wealth is measured by how much more we have than others, as we know. So gaming those systems in a lot of ways is easier than actually changing things to benefit everyone. But the dark triad here of nouveau Taylorism, warped neoliberalism, and the by-the-book Buchananism that's being used has created an interestingly robust support for this process. And it's kind of locked us into a bit of a corner in terms of business and economy. For me, the kind of idea of Tautai and the inclusiveness and the exploratory nature of that for the benefit of all is pretty much diametrically opposed to that in terms of ecosystemic and cultural awareness. So when we talk about survival of the luckiest, I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but I always find this an interesting one. Most of our Western business approaches come from that idea of, this is the best way to make money. This is the best way to manage. And realistically, it was just fit enough at the right time. It made money, but it didn't make money for as long as we thought. For example, when Ford brought in Taylorism into Ford and he became the dominant car manufacturer, what's often left off that is the fact that he didn't do it indefinitely. It was for 6 years. And then he lost out to General Motors because he refused to change anything. His production lines were so rigid that he became irrelevant. The orthodoxy changed, right? And that's seen as the gold standard. Now, I don't believe that they ever would have used humans if Ford and Taylor had access to automation. They just wanted the most efficient way to do something in quite a causal and linear domain. The fact that we try to map this out into complex circumstances, it's no wonder why things are problematic in business. But then going back to something, I think it was in Sonia's talk, it's very, very difficult to explain this to CEOs of large corporations and leaders in large corporations. Speaking of corporations, this is generally how I find people tend to view them. Okay, so it's traditionally a mature organization with modern management. It's this large single entity. It's complicated. It requires a lot of expertise. Maybe it has segregated sections, but there's a captain at the top and they give orders with total control of their vessel. It's rigid, it's robust. It may take some time to maneuver, but it's unstoppable. It has great momentum. I mean, I say this and I get stuff like IBM coming to mind, for example. Perhaps it's even touted as unsinkable, the pinnacle of a successful system, preferably focusing probably on profit. It is, as I'm sure many of you have found, and certainly I find, very, very hard to influence a captain of a company like this, despite having vital information and insights, even if you build a good relationship with them. And as I mentioned, there's that cautionary tale in the story of the El Faro. And part of that came, as we mentioned, from the reliance on tools. When you have tools, when you have frameworks, when you have things that give you that lower energy cost and tell you how you can just sit back and let things get done almost automatically, this is something that we all seek in a lot of the stuff that we do. Change is hard. Navigating complexity is hard. We don't like hard things necessarily. So we adopt something, or we buy into it, or we hear other people adopting it, and we kind of take the mantle upon it. The problem is, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. You don't necessarily use the right tool for the right job. And that works with metrics as well. That's where the complacency and the over-reliance on the tools that we have can come from. Realistically, a system such as an organization is actually moving more like a flotilla of ships. And again, I've gone back to kind of the Tautai symbology here. It's not just a flotilla of smaller craft, but it's individual, unique collections of people on similar but unique journeys together. And this is often where the comparison ends, unfortunately, because people still have that kind of idea of this big entity with a big captain at the top and so on. So you kind of get a flotilla of ships which are being forced to act like a meta ship, if you like, a bit of a Voltron. Now, if this is all working as it should be, if this is working as Tautai moved entire nations from one small island to another across the vast Pacific, you may have shared or different roles or purposes, but you're all invested in reaching the same outcome collaboratively, right? You're using qualitative and quantitative data in tandem. Transparently, everyone knows their role. They're inspired to be a part of this, and they're inspired to do their best for success because they're engaged, invested in the outcome, and included in that success. Each canoe might have a different local culture in the same way that every team and department may have different cultures, but there's a nurturing and shared meta culture between them all, and a supportive element, right, that's needed to move that entire culture. The boats are faster, they're more maneuverable, they can still carry an awful lot of stuff. You can carry a lot on some of these boats, some of them are huge. And everyone's a part of what is happening, and they understand it, even if they aren't the experts. The people making the decisions are talking to other people. They're not just making those decisions in isolation, and they have relevant information to do so. That's a far cry from what happened with the El Faro and with a lot of the way that modern management does tend to work. So I think we innately understand this complexity, and we've become very conditioned that things should be simple, and the modern world has done that quite effectively. And I think it's interesting when you look at how these boats have to submit to their complex environment. They have to pay attention to the affordances, and they respect it, they accept it, they understand it, they influence their environment. They don't battle it, and they don't treat it like an alien world to be wrested under their control. So there's a marked difference in approach there. Now, something I think that's very interesting in terms of how we deal with complex systems is this idea of allostasis. I hear us talking about homeostasis quite a lot, and I think we need to talk more about allostasis as well. So with homeostasis, we have that idea of stability through adjustment, that we're kind of maintaining, if you like. We want minimal variability. We want to maintain, for example, a very specific body temperature at our core. And there may be minor fluctuations, but the internal systems of the body for homeostasis are there to make sure that that does not significantly have variance. But then we have allostasis, and allostasis is this idea of stability through change, which is much more of a complex systems approach, where it's much more adaptive. You've got much better dynamic feedback loops, and it arises in response to stressors, things outside us. We have this physiological and behavioral variability to help us deal with what is happening to us, which hopefully then brings us back to where homeostasis maintains us and keeps us steady. And I think that, biologically, both these processes are extremely important, but I think that in terms of understanding and dealing with ecosystems and complex systems, they're also extremely important as well. So that's kind of where we get back to the survival of the luckiest and the requisite resilience and agility, sorry, to adapt to and exploit kind of the surroundings far more. So when I talk about agility and resilience, they're kind of two sides of a coin, I think, for me. And just talking about allostasis, resilience is allostatic in nature, right? It's trying to bring you back to a point where you have this kind of equilibrium, if you like. But in terms of what we have in agility, I tend to talk about agility as a concept, a more abstracted concept. I tend not to want to talk too much about capital A, agile and so on, because there is a basis in all of this business agility in general, capital A, agile. Agility really is made of three things for me: the ability to adapt, accept, and react, change, repurpose, respond. I think it's worth highlighting that a reaction is generally reflexive, whereas a response is generally a choice. So that's something to bear in mind. But we do that based upon the affordances in the environment around us. And then we have resilience. And there are three parts to the resilience as well. We have hopefully some kind of early weak signal detection where we don't show complacency. We're always aware of feedback. We look for catastrophic failure. Safe failure is not a problem because there are lessons in that. Catastrophic failure we want to avoid, that should be avoided where we can. You can't always avoid it. That's just not how the universe works. So hopefully, if we do then experience this catastrophic failure, we have the ability to recover as swiftly as possible through agility, through learning, through emerging safety, psychological safety. We can try and regain that equilibrium. And if we do it fast enough, we may then be able to swiftly exploit the new paradigm that exists and find multiple pathways or new pathways to maybe new goals, right? Emergent opportunities and so on. So this is where the exploitation part is where your radical, novel, new success can happen in chaotic circumstances when you throw everything into trying to exploit something because you see an opportunity and it works. So the ability to change, recover, and respond with appropriate speed and grace is how I define these two things. And they require appropriate friction and constraints. So I did a post a little while back, and one of the things I asked was essentially, if you're coasting with no friction, because I see an awful lot about we need frictionless delivery, we don't want friction and tension, we need those things. If you're frictionless, how do you pivot? How do you slow if you need to? How do you gain traction without friction, right? If I'm rappelling down something, I do rock climbing, I could reach the bottom extremely quickly. It's not all about the speed. I'd rather do it with the requisite friction and safety, especially because I have a fear of heights. So I've obviously picked one of the best possible sports. So what do I mean by leading and not managing? Well, this is something I'm going to get to when I look at the results pyramid. When we're talking about requisite tension and friction, we're talking about cognitive, distributed cognition, as I've done a few slides back. We're then looking at work that David Marquet has actually proven in practice. So again, we can extrapolate quite a lot to a marine environment here, which is why it's quite useful. But he has, in practice, in anger, implemented a lot of this stuff through intent-based leadership, through utilizing the correct language from the beginning to ensure that people are aligned, people are enabled to empower themselves, right? So, and for those of you who don't know what David Marquet did, he said, it's unfair and unproductive for me to try and be the only leader. He was given a submarine where he didn't understand the controls. He hadn't been trained on it. He knew this wasn't going to work particularly well, and he didn't have long. I think it was 6 months to literally turn the ship around, which is the name, of course, of his first book. So he made everyone around him a leader, this leadership model. It wasn't even servant leadership, it was leader leadership. Anyone can be a leader. We're not constrained by our job title, you know, by our role necessarily. And he did something really important, which was change us and them, this compartmentalization into we. He trusted people to do the jobs they were hired for. He gave them accountability, responsibility, ownership. He encouraged all of this. And he didn't lose power or strategic decision-making capability by doing it. He just changed what decisions were being made by whom, and the ecosystem ended up working better because everyone was a part, not a part. In fact, I think everyone ended up much less utilized, but much more productive. And in a set of societies and in a modern culture where we're still valued for the hours we work, not the outcomes we achieve, how busy we look, not what we actually do, I think that that's really important and really progressive. But he realized that there's no opportunity without risk, and you have to experiment. You have to try and make failure safe, not catastrophic. And you can't do that in a traditional bureaucracy. You can't do that without the right language. There's something I think we've probably all seen before, but I threw it in as a bit of a tongue-in-cheek thing. I'm going to explore that a little bit more on the next slide, which is the results pyramid here. Now, for those of you who've not seen this before, this is slightly tweaked. But pretty much everything that happens above the line is what I see in the majority of organizations I work with, and with a lot of consultancies and with a lot of transformation that are actually in play. There's a misunderstanding that everything above the line is all you need: roles, responsibilities, policies, processes, ways of working, tools, all of that kind of stuff. But that's where management lives. That's where frameworks and bosses tend to sit. It's ways of doing things, it's instructions. And we do need those actions to produce results. But the problem is, if we force people to actions and they don't believe in those actions, they will learn how to game the system, the new system that's in place, and then they will go back to performing the actions that their beliefs dictate, which means that the results that you need to drive you towards an outcome are likely to not be the right ones. So you manage systems and structures, but you need more than that for this stuff to sustain and to be built at a foundational and fundamental level. And that's where everything below the line comes in. You look at the complex approaches where lenses are used to orient. You've got coaching is usually somewhere in here. And I think that this is where really leaders sit as well, because systems and structures are managed, but culture and people have to be led. And what dictates culture and people are the experiences and the beliefs, which long-term drive the actions, which drive the results and get you towards the outcome. Management very often makes the mistake of only working on the action layer. And that's where you get your coercing, your compelling, your wait and see tactics. It's just not sustainable. So getting leaders to create new experiences that generate or reinforce the kind of desired cultural beliefs which drive new actions and deliver the desired results is kind of what we need to be doing. And it all starts from the language. The language is really, really important. So language is probably the only concept in complex explorations which I think needs to be set firmly right at the beginning, because it very, very quickly ossifies. And if it's wrong, it's very, very hard to change. Right? We need to use that language from the start so people understand and share concepts properly. Look at scientists who are being trained. And that's why the narrative songs and stories of Tautai are so powerful. They set the language and they set the concepts really, really early on. And that can happen osmotically, and it's very unnoticed and it's very easy. But that also sometimes requires you to be radical, to be deliberate, to consciously use language and try to embed it. So we need to consciously and unconsciously use the right language. And hopefully, if we can do these things, we can start moving from me to we. We've got this kind of intent and trust. We can resolve our own issues collaboratively. All of these things that we try to move towards, and that David Marquet speaks of in his books. The other thing he speaks of in Leadership as Language, which I think is really interesting, is the idea between red work and blue work. So traditionally, this is what we have. We have the managers think, and this is very much the case for what happened in Al Faro, and then the workers do. They avoid variability. They prove things. They conform. Go and do the thing. Is it the right thing? Very often, they don't even have the shared voice enough to question that. Whereas when you look at something like Tautai, everyone thinks, everyone does, everyone embraces that variability. Everyone looks to improve rather than prove. There's a collaborative element to it. And in times of duress, the blue parts, the thinking parts, are actually increased, not decreased, so that you can really work out where you are. And you think and act, but then you think again to make sure that you're still going in the right direction. We then look at how the culture is also defined. We know that it's driven from the top down. We always talk about leadership buy-in, and realistically, we know it's kind of disseminated from the bottom up by the interactions between people and teams, but it is defined by the actions and the inactions of leaders. Leadership is being an exemplar for people. So there's also a dependency upon the model of legitimacy, and I think this was touched on in a couple of the talks earlier as well. It doesn't matter what you say and what you want to happen. If you continue to reward people in the same way, especially for bad behaviors, why would they change? So if you want that kind of movement over time, and you want this shift, and that you want this learning, this kind of exploration and evolution, you have to change what makes people legitimate within this system as well. I wanted to very quickly touch on this because I think it's important. And I was really glad to hear it earlier in a couple of talks as well. We need to be fair to managers and leaders here. You know, this is a conditioning thing. There's immense pressure from conditioning, market expectations, 100+ years of profit making in very specific ways, right? So they're not psychologically safe a lot of the time. There's less time to make more decisions. They feel under pressure to never make a mistake, never admit that they're wrong, not really be human, right? Overpromise and then hope that you can deliver. You need to have all of those answers. You have to be able to then just, they've become very good at gaming that poor system effectively. We can help them make better, more accurate decisions. But it requires courage. It requires positioning things. And actually, I found that rather than talking about complexity, getting them to do complex things and then letting them know they've been doing them is sometimes a more effective approach. So the single most important thing a leader can do, like I said, is inspire other leaders and lead by example, right? But it can be hard for everyone to be human. One of the things I think that we need to learn more is kind of not just the agile coaching, the executive coaching side, but the human coaching side, if you like, allowing leaders to be vulnerable and to be human, to, you know, be authentic, be authentically human, I think is really, really important. And to be able to say to them, look, it's okay not to be okay. I'm a big advocate for mental health. I speak about kintsugi and a lot of other things to do with this. It's okay not to be okay for leaders as well. Ultimately, we are all human, right? And sometimes we need that external validation and guidance, and that's okay as well. Oh, no, there we go. So I'm just going to touch very quickly on this because I'm just aware of time. We're pretty much there. This is one of the lenses that I use. This is Cynefin. I'm very happy to give this out to anyone who wants to have a look at it, but you can see the energy shifts in here and why it's so catastrophic if we fall out of that clear domain into chaos, right? So you must set those fundamentals, the decisions, the culture, the language at the beginning. The more complacent you get with those things, the more likely you are to find some catastrophic failure. And of course, I wanted to drop something quickly about OODA loops in here as well. Tautai doesn't inhibit its own human and harmonized OODA loops. So Cynefin kind of sits in the Orient part of this. I think that looking at the OODA loops is important because there's no point in simply being able to move around a loop where we observe, orient, decide, and act if we are making the wrong decisions, if we're not orienting properly, if there's too much data and we can't filter it and we're out of context. So sometimes being able to stop and take a breath and assess where we are, do that sense making is really, really, really important. I'm going to skip through this because I'm aware that we are at time. I was going to talk about learning a little bit. I think the most important thing there again is that for leading and teaching, the primary focus is to inspire other people to be leaders, which is where we then get to helping create that psychological safety where we're included, we can learn, we can contribute, and we can finally challenge. And that all comes from the relationships, the interactions, human linkages, the enabling constraints that we have in the complex systems around us. So back to that first slide, the last slide here. Knowing where you are by knowing where you've been, I think is a nice way to put it. All these things are part of the inherent leadership and the manner, if you like, of Tautai. And I wonder if the islanders would have populated the Pacific and developed the culture that they have if we'd simply just tried to create certainty and convenience. I think exploring the unknown and learning more is an itch for our species. And it may explain probably why conspiracy theories are so popular, but this is a wayfinding thing, and I think that it is innately human, and ultimately leading is about being an exemplar, inspiring others to also be exemplars and to do something. So I think we can learn a lot about leadership from Tautai, and I will leave it there. Thank you very much.